Okay, welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the first O'Donnell lecture in our new home in the Schwarzman Centre. And it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Aaron Griffith to Oxford as Oxford's O'Donnell lecturer for 2026. Aaron gained his PhD from the University of Chicago on studies in insular Celtic historical phonology and morphology. Having spent periods of time at Harvard and Vienna, he was appointed assistant professor in Celtic and classics at Utrecht in 2014. He's interested in language variation and change across the medieval Celtic languages, especially Old Irish, and has published widely on all aspects of the historical grammar, phonology, morphology, and syntax of Old Irish. He's going to talk to us today about a particularly difficult question in the history of the Irish language, namely, why is there so much variation that we don't understand? So his title today is Old Irish, Plenty of Variation, but of what kind? Thank you, Aaron. Over to you.
So, thank you. Yes. So, I'm just going to jump in. The Tower of Babel in the background here. So, language variation in Old Irish. I assume you all are familiar with the basics, but it's good to set sort of the background. So, give you a couple of very basic backgrounds in case you have forgotten some of your Old Irish or things like that, which happens. So, the language was, Old Irish is 600 to 900, and spoken across the entire island of Ireland, the Isle of Man, parts of Wales and Scotland. We have limited numbers of sources in contemporary manuscripts. We have lots of material, but it's usually in later copies. Now, we find variation in the sources to a limited degree. So Strand has talked about scribal variation. There's been diachronic variation suggested, and also register variation. So sort of a more formal versus the colloquial spoken language. However, Old Irish is traditionally taken to be a language without dialect. So this was O'Rahilly's position and Jackson's position. That's weird. It would be very unusual to have a language without dialectal variation, especially in the size of the island of Ireland, not to speak of, say, Wales, Scotland, and Man. You can compare the situation in modern Irish, where we find very, very strong dialectal differences. So, just to give you a little bit on the sources, because that's important. I mentioned that very briefly, but here, most of our sources are Middle Irish copies of Old Irish originals. They're useful for very, very many things, specifically for phonology, which is something I'm going to be talking about quite a bit today. They're less useful because there were vast changes between Old Irish and Middle Irish, and the Middle Irish copies have not maintained all of the information of the originals. Interestingly, the Old Irish originals are also themselves copies, as far as we can tell, but they were made in the Old Irish period, so they are by definition Old Irish. The three main collections are all glosses. The Würzburg glosses from around 750. These are glosses on the Pauline Gospels. The Milan glosses, approximately 50 years later, 800, which is a commentary, are glosses on a commentary on the Psalms, and the St. Gall glosses around 50 years later, again 850, which are on Priscian's Institutiones Grammaticae. As I said, this is Old Irish by definition because it was written in the Old Irish period. Although see below where I'll talk a little bit about Macomb, as one does. How do you deal then? How do we explain this lack of dialectal variation in the written sources? I would say there's been 2.5 main approaches. The half of an approach is no comment. There is none. there is no dialectal variation. However, more recently, there's been two approaches to this, one by my boss, Peter Schrijver. He looks at this from a lens of language shift. So language contact and language shift. The second, well, I guess second and a half, anyway, approach is by Peder O'Mwerchety, a year later, who was looking within historical sociolinguistics, looking in social networks and power relationships. Now, I'll talk more about this so you have some idea of what this all means. So to start with Peter Schrijver, his assumption is that the written language situation reflects the spoken language situation. Now, this is an assumption and it's not uncontroversial, but he's working with that in mind. And the theory he has there is one by Thomason and Kaufmann on language contact, and specifically language shift. His suggestion is that, first on what you might expect under language shift. If adult speakers of a language shift or learn another language and speak that, they often bring features of their first language with them. So I teach at a Dutch university. You can find typical Dutch English sorts of features. That happens all over the place. And so Peter used this idea to try to explain the lack of variation in the Old Irish sources that we find. So what he looked for was evidence of sort of a pre-Irish language. Not I probably should say not pre-Irish, but a language other than Irish. So I should have said non. Oh well, too late now. And then to see also if there's evidence for language shift within Ireland. Now, his conclusions are this. I'm leaving out most of the argumentation, but that there's evidence for a non-Irish language in Ireland until the 6th century is his argument. Among other things, there are a bunch of words with P, which we would not expect, the one partham for crab. So you find a bunch of words that have a P in them, and you can't explain that as from standard Irish, because Irish doesn't have a P. And so he suggests that Old Irish is the result of a very late expansion of the language within Ireland. And he would say then that there are no dialects because they didn't have time to develop yet. So the time depth is shallow. He also has sort of connections. He tries to bring in archaeological evidence, saying that the archaeological evidence is very limited in Ireland. I think archaeologists struggle with this. In the period, there's simply not a lot there. But it looks as if there was a movement of a lowland Celtic tribe fleeing the Roman invasion of Britain in the 1st century Common Era. And that also happens to be the period when we can start to see the differentiation of British Celtic from Goidelic. And Peter also argues that Lowland Celtic, different than Highland Celtic, is the source of Irish. I don't expect you've now internalized everything here, but I need to give the broad strokes view of what Peter's talking about. Adult speakers of a non-Irish language shifted to learn. They learned Irish during a massive and rapid expansion of Irish within Ireland at a fairly shallow time depth. And that would explain then why we have limited, we just simply don't have dialects. Peder O'Mwerchety worked with a very different set of assumptions and had a very different set of conclusions. His assumption is essentially that the written language situation reflects a literary standard, or if not a literary standard, a prestigious dialect. He's working within historical sociolinguistics, there's a long tradition there, where you have to examine language in its social use, the networks of power, things like that. And his method was to analyze the historical record for social networks, power centers, and to try to connect that social situation to the linguistic one, both past and present. He was also interested in the dialect geography of the modern Gaelic and Irish dialects. So he was working in parallel on a couple of different things in his dissertation. So he came to very different conclusions. So he said that the political and ecclesiastical power center around Armagh created a prestige-based standard. And this was starting before the Old Irish period, I think the mid-5th century with the expansion of the O'Neills, and lasted throughout the Old Irish period. This was such a center of prestige that dialect, the Irish that was spoken in and around Armagh, became sort of the model. And it so happens that the gloss collections we have are mostly from the northeast of Ireland, and so that it's not representative of the entire range of Old Irish spoken in Ireland. It's simply what we have. He also doesn't limit himself to the northeast of Ireland. He looks also in Munster and sees certain dialect features in the south that he argues can only really be explained in the Old Irish period already. So with the expansion of the Déisi into County Clare. Just to give a graphic indication, what I'm talking about here is there's a number of features that sort of pattern here in the modern period. And he argues that there's no real good way to explain that unless we look in the Old Irish period already for the expansion of the Déisi. So it is, we have two very different theories about why Old Irish appears not to show sort of dialect variation. So what do we make of these? I find Peadder's more convincing. I talked with Peter about this. He is my boss. And he said, oh, you don't need to inform me before you publicly disagree with me. But that's sort of how Peter is. But I thought, I'm going to have another conversation with him about this sometime next month. But I find Peadder's explanation more convincing. I think it's able to unite the political history and the linguistics quite well for the main Old Irish documents that we have. And it also seems to explain some of the facts that we see further to the southwest. But I think most important is that, the O'Neill Armagh sort of power center in the northeast is then responsible for what we see as a lack of dialects in the written record. I don't think Peter Schrijver is totally wrong, however. I think that might work for an earlier period. That is, Irish had to get to Ireland somehow and somewhere, we know where, so at some time. It's possible that happened through sort of massive waves of different groups, but it's also quite possible that happened as sort of a singular sort of a choke point, and that one group entered Ireland and sort of expanded. That would mean that it's possible that there was, that his sort of explanation would work at an earlier period. And then, so for instance, I think I'll leave it at that and say that I think that he may be right earlier, but I think O'Murphy is better able to explain the situation that we actually see in Old Irish. Now, if we want to look more for dialects in Old Irish, sort of what do we do? How do we move forward? Peadder suggests two things, two possible ways. One is looking for a correlation of medieval features with modern features. This has always been sort of the difficult part. We just can't find them. Or what we find is not easy to map. The second one is to locate contemporary texts in space and time, to basically, starting from Middle Irish, say, okay, well, we can find a bunch of texts that we can localize to this area of Munster, or this group of texts we can localize to this area in Leinster. And then starting from Middle Irish, sort of work backwards and forwards and see what we can get to. Now, of these methods, the first one has been generally tried and it hasn't worked. As I mentioned, it's unclear how to map these features of Old Irish. We do have variation, but we can't map it. The second one has rarely been tried, however, in early Irish. Interestingly, Patricia Kelly looked at Old Irish animal names and found in the Breath of Nevis texts that there seems to be different names than we find in our more standard sort of Old Irish texts. That would suggest perhaps there was dialectal differences there in animal names. And Kevin Murray has done the same for onomastics. Branagh and O'Malley have done similar things for later Middle Irish. This is also the focus of a current project by David Stifter in Maynooth, who is looking for diatopic variation in early Irish. So people are starting to look in this, sort of go in this direction more seriously. Okay. So, what do we make then of the situation of language variation in early Irish? I think that the apparent uniformity of Old Irish is probably a mirage, and it's based on a single prestige dialect. This was centered around Armagh, and people then wanted to emulate that standard, even in centers such as in Munster. Now, I have thus far sort of given the impression that Old Irish is simply this totally monolithic entity, and you might be asking yourselves, well then, why were you talking about variation? Now I'm going to get to that part. So we do, within this sort of seemingly monolithic entity, we do find variation. So we find scribal variation, we find diachronic variation, and we find register variation. The most recent work on this is a PhD thesis by Ariana Malfauner from Trinity. And she goes through our three main sources and looks for things that are, variation, sort of broadly construed. So she examines a range of features that vary across the three major gloss corpora. And she notes as well features that are particular to one of these corpora. So Würzburg, Milan, or St. Gall. She gives a special focus to features that are unique to Milan or are differently present in Milan. Because being sort of the middle gloss collection sort of in time, you can't argue that there's some sort of diachronic development. She argues that some of these things are probably due to a different language variety. Now, that may be a dialect or may not, but that's sort of her approach to the variation. Now, the main takeaways from her work is that there are many features, there are many types of variation. So she finds some that are seemingly orthographic, so ash, or long or short for a, reflecting, of course, the Latin monophthongization of I to a, is differently present in the different glosses. There's also some phonological, apparently phonological difference. So kech, each, is how it appears in Milan, but kach, each, is the form in Würzburg and St. Gall. Pretonic U versus O, these are some differences that she finds. And she does find what she argues is a diatopic feature. In daas, than, so bigger than he is found only in Milan, while old daas is found in all three gloss collections. And she suggests, also I should mention that in daas is what later gives na in modern Irish, which is the comparative particle. So if you have old daas in all three collections, but you have indos in Milan, and this is the later form. What type of variation is that? Well, she says it can't be orthographic variation because in and ol that can't be orthographic. Pure diachronic development is also problematic because why is it in sort of the middle collection, Milan, but not in the later one at all, St. Gall? Diastratic or so register variation is also unlikely. Why should the register be different in Milan than it is in Würzburg or St. Gall? And so her suggestion is that this may be a possible dialect innovation. More generally, she suggests that Milan represents a different variety of Old Irish, or it adhered to a different written standard. Okay. Now, as Humanities has argued, and I think is the most convincing explanation I've seen thus far, the standard, what we take as the Old Irish standard, is really just a prestigious local variety. This, though, still allows for diatopic variation, I think. It wouldn't rule out the fact that there would be dialect variation, because as the O'Neill territory was fairly large, you'd expect there to be differences within it. This explanation, though, also allows for diastratic variation, I think reflecting the reality of early Irish social stratification. So we know that there were it was a highly leveled society in terms of rights of the various people, and possibly with different institutional norms. So we would expect that register variation would be possible. And of course, orthographic and scribal variation should also be possible as also diachronic. But the main issue is we don't know what to look for exactly. Now, at least for diatopic, we simply have a difficult time getting a handle on it. I think the footing is better for diachronic variation because we know both where Irish came from and where it's going, in a sense. We know Middle Irish, and the comparative method gives us sort of a reconstructible preform. However, it's very difficult because diachronic change is often confounded with diastratic variation. So register variation is often difficult to separate from diachronic change. That is, if we find a change, is this, well, actually, you know what? I'm just going to talk about McCone because this is his basic argument. In an influential article from 1985, he knew he was being tendentious with his title, but he says, the Würzburg and Milan glosses are earliest sources of Middle Irish. He argues there that Old Irish was a standardized language, an elevated register. And it differed from the spoken language already by 750, by the date of Würzburg, our earliest major source. So he's arguing that there is essentially diachronic variation in Irish at that point. The language is changing, but because it was a standardized sort of language, it masks that. It's only through sort of glimpses of later changes that sort of creep in as errors into the standard language that we can see what diachronic changes are already happening. Now, this has been very, very sort of literature heavy, reviewing stuff. Now I'm going to get to what I hope is my major contribution to, well, major I guess is up for you to decide, but contribution, how about leave it there? By looking at final vowels of Irish. Now, I think this offers a very good testing ground for language change. McCone correctly states that early Old Irish had 5 final vowels, A, E, A, O, U, and he argues that the absorption of O by A, so that there was a change of O to A, was early. And he suggests that even in Würzburg, really there were only 4, by the spoken language by the time of Würzburg only had 4 final vowels. And that the writing as O was simply sort of an orthographic archaism. Interestingly, Middle Irish had only 1 final vowel, which schwa, with 2 allophones. He suggests, that final vowel errors are found in the writing in Milan for nearly all vowels. So the schwa must have already been in the spoken language, and the scribes sometimes wrote the wrong vowel because they were sort of thinking in their spoken language, but then writing the standard and got it wrong. He does acknowledge, however, that the number of errors is very small, and so the collapse was really only in this colloquial register. The errors were then lapses. I will note, though, some points of caution when approaching McCone's article. His data collection is illustrative. He's not systematic. He notes this. He didn't go through everything. He picked out the examples. And I think the diachronic and diastratic interpretations are entangled. This is admittedly a very difficult problem, but he also didn't look at St. Gall. So I think that already sort of leaves a lot of room for wrong inference if you don't have the third comparandum there as well. Okay, so his primary example of vowel collapse is O to A. It usually appears as O in Würzburg, but A in Milan. He doesn't give numbers, but these have now been collected by Malthaner. I think I'll skip this. O doesn't come up very often, only really in significant numbers in the I and U stem genitives, singular and dual. These are the figures. Ariana Malthaner and I collaborated on this because we each had missed a couple examples and had each collected independently. So I hope by now we've gotten everything. But I noticed that she just published a paper that cites this and that has this data, and it's slightly different than my list still. So I'm going to have to go back and check it again. But that's okay. If you look at this, it looks like Milan and St. Gall pattern a little bit together against Würzburg. That is, they both have more A's than O's, where Würzburg has more O than A. However, they all are statistically different from one another if you just look at these numbers here. But there's an important assumption when you do this, and that is that the I stems and the U stems behave the same. I decided to split them out and look at the different behaviors. And here you find a very different looking picture. The I stems look basically the same across all three gloss collections, where the U stems look different. So U stems are still favor O in Würzburg, strongly favor A in Milan, and relatively strongly favor A in St. Gall. So, yeah. The problem is simple statistical tests probably don't work anymore. I try to always to keep my statistics simple for my own sake, but also, yeah. However, that won't work here. So I decided to embrace the complexity and, yeah, gathered all sorts of data for basically every single ending. I looked at the source, the form, the ending, the stem class, the gender, the number of syllables in the word, the lemma, and a feature of rounding, sort of what type of sound preceded that. I've also collected more data. I've also looked at the following sound, but that's for another time. So I made a humongous table, as one does, and then I decided to use general linear mixed models. This is the point where I assume that some eyes will glaze over when I start talking about statistics. I get it. I will try to take you along with me. Basically, what this allows you to do is test a whole bunch of things at the same time, to look at all of these different variables, but also let you factor in the fact that some of the words come from the same. So say 75 examples might be gnivo of a deed. Gnivo might behave differently than another word. Say denva of a deed, different word. But so this allows you to factor in the possibility that individual lemmas behave differently. So it allows you to test a whole lot of stuff. It's very complicated. I spent many months teaching myself this. And I used R, the computer, to do this, and it gave me a lovely table. If you're not familiar with statistics of this type, you're probably hoping I will go very fast past this. I'm not. I am going to go quickly, but I'm going to try to sort of explain what this is showing. This is saying the Würzburg data shows a significant deviation from a 50-50 chance of O versus A, and it's more likely to be O. Okay, we already knew that. But it also tells us that St. Gall is not statistically different from Würzburg. It tells us, though, Milan is, and is much more likely to have A. So far, you probably are thinking, yes, Aaron, you're telling me what we already knew. I hope there's more new to come. A U stem, however, makes the ending A much more likely. And that's statistically significant. Also, having a preceding palatalized consonant makes O significantly more likely. I did not expect that, but there it is. Having a preceding labial doesn't matter. Gender of the noun doesn't matter. And the number of syllables matters a little bit. The longer the word makes more likely to have an A. So Milan is significantly different from the other glosses and is more likely to have A. This fits in within other research, but the reason for it is not entirely clear. So why is Milan different? The fact that a preceding consonant makes an O more likely, I think there's a phonetic interpretation. I'm not sure if I'm right, but I think that it has to do with contrast, that the O is easier to maintain as a contrastive segment after the palatalized consonant. I think this might be a red herring, though, because after I ran the statistics, I discovered something different, something new. I'll talk about that in a second. That might make this particular point irrelevant. The longer that a word is, the higher the chance of an A. I think this may be, the idea is that Irish has a very strong initial accent, and the further away you get from that, I think a rounded vowel, A is the most basic vowel. I think you're more likely to get that than an O with a longer word. The fact that the U stems increase the chance of O is less clear, because sound change shouldn't work together with morphology. Speakers shouldn't be able to access that and say, yes, U stem, it doesn't work that way. So I think, though, there is a way to sort of get phonetics in there. I think that I think that there may have been a slight difference. They were both O, but that the U stem ending may have been slightly more open than the I stem ending. Both could be spelled O or A because it was an incipient merger, but only the A actually began to merge with A in Old Irish. Now, this explanation is only possible if the two endings have a different etymological source. There's been some discussion about that in the literature. I obviously support the people who say there was a difference. Jay was one of my teachers, Jay Jasanoff and Schumacher. I think McCone here might have been wrong. Now, I admit I cannot prove this, my interpretation, because basically there's no independent evidence for it. There can't be. It's plausible, however. And it's basically could explain why there is this difference. Even if I'm wrong, though, we still have the difference. So, Milan is the outlier. It's highly different from Würzburg, different from St. Gall. But the broader implications, I think, for final vowels are unclear. This was McCone's Paradebeispiel, which I've been told there's an English phrase, parade example, but I don't know. I think it's just a loan translation. Anyway, this was McCone's Paradebeispiel for vowel collapse. But I think they rather didn't collapse. That is, at least for the I stems. And if I'm right, then this actually requires more vowels rather than less, and only very limited support for vowel collapse. So more data, please. That's usually not possible, but I decided to see what I could do. So I looked at all final vowels in the glosses. Sorry, no, I shouldn't overstate it. I didn't get to all of Würzburg yet. Basically, McCone says there are 11 cases of final vowel confusion in Würzburg, about 60 in Milan and over 90 from St. Gall, and they show almost sort of every possible type of confusion. And this is what I mentioned. He explains this, that the final vowels were really just schwa, and the speaker had to sort of know which schwa he was writing in any one particular case. And sometimes they got it wrong. So he argues that there was basically a colloquial loss of vowel distinction, but in the formal register, they maintained 4 vowels. So I looked for all absolutely final unaccented vowels in the glosses in polysyllabic words following a consonant. I did all this for Milan and St. Gall. I am partially through Würzburg. By partially, I mean I got through 25% of it. So I looked at sort of what you find. How many different vowels, whether the sound before it is palatalized or not, and also sort of the number of errors. In Würzburg, there are remarkably few errors. This has been known. It was a copy, but he did a very good job of copying his exemplar without making sort of the usual copying mistakes that we find. Exceptions are exceedingly small in number. The only exception is O, where, as we saw, O and A, that's about, the A is about 20% of the total. But interestingly, this is a very uncommon sort of ending anyway. I think it makes up less than 10% of the total sort of endings are O. E and A are extremely common, U fairly common, A less so. Yeah, and I think the most common error could be seen as leaving off the final letter. So you're copying, and perhaps you forgot the last letter. But the number of examples is very small, so I won't insist on that. Yeah, but I think, yeah, at least for Würzburg, O does not appear to be falling together with A to any great degree. And the other vowels are very well differentiated, almost perfectly. It's a little bit different in Milan. So yeah, here I collected about 5,000 different examples. The distribution is roughly similar. So E and A are very common. U, then A, then O. There's a lot more errors. So I classified these as well. The most common one is writing A for O, where we saw here there's many more examples of the wrong ending than there are of the right one. But still, errors are usually small in number, less than 1.5% of the total. I don't have a good sense of a baseline. What is good or bad as you're copying? I've talked to a handwriting expert, but I haven't gotten an answer yet. Sort of just out of curiosity, I would be also hesitant of sort of equating, say, you or I writing versus a trained scribe. But at this point, I simply make it an observation. Most of the errors are less than 1.5%. Yeah, the exception being O, which is indeed weakly represented. Again, the most common error could be seen as leaving off the final letter. The Milan copyist was much less careful than the Würzburg copyist, so there's a lot more examples of ditography or leaving out things. So I think that this is quite a plausible explanation. There's simply a copying mistake. But again, I think it's unclear that there's a strong indication here of vowels falling together. It really is very limited, because saying, oh, there's 60 examples of vowel error, that may sound like a lot, but there are over 5,000 vowels. So I think when you see it that way, it's much more limited. That was actually why I made this collection, because I wanted to know the scope. What does it mean to have 60 errors? What does it mean to have 11 in Würzburg? And then I came across St. Gall, where there were over 90. Actually, it's even more than that. There's an important note, but it's not important enough that I actually want to talk about it with you. But I felt sort of professionally obligated to put it up there. Basically, I can talk about what I did with the ash symbol. If now, of course, you're all looking at it because I said don't. That was bad rhetoric on my part. Okay. what I do want you to notice is one particular, or two particular lines. There are no examples in St. Gall of an A or an O following a palatalized consonant. There aren't any. That's weird. They're always written as A. This has been noted for some of the examples. That, for instance, I think Ternheisen notes that do foingla is written do foingle, mostly, in St. Gall. But this is actually a rule. And this hasn't been seen before. So it's simply an exceptionless sound change that's represented in St. Gall. O and A after palatalized consonants become E in St. Gall. It's too many examples written exceptionlessly to be a schwa writing. I don't think that's the case. It was about 30 examples in total. So it's not a huge number, but it's enough. Now, further, there are 107 examples of A written for E after a non-palatalized consonant, besides 259 of it correctly. I think this is a sound change in progress, or at least possibly an orthographic change, but I think it's reflecting a sound change. Also, there's a slight tendency for U to become O, but that's less prevalent. So what do I make of this? Well, after palatalized consonants, there are only 3 vowels in final position in St. Gall. So we have a 3-vowel system, not a 5-vowel system after palatalized consonants. After non-palatalized consonants, there's a strong tendency for E to become A and for O to become A. This is also showing an incipient 3-vowel system following non-palatalized consonants. So we're seeing here the change as it's happening. Well, that's a little overdramatic, sorry. We're seeing the change. So it's clear that it's happening here, but it still doesn't confirm McCone's claim that final vowels had essentially fallen together by 800. If that were the case, I don't think we would find this exceptionless writing of O and A as E after a palatalized consonant. And the reduction is not as advanced after non-palatalized consonants, but it's becoming more so. Well, yeah. Like I said, McCone acknowledges that Milan mostly gets things right, and so he assumes that the vernacular, but he still suggests that a vernacular schwa was responsible. I don't think that works, given the St. Gall data. Now, you could say, well, the St. Gall scribe worked differently than the Milan scribe. It's possible, but I think that it's probably more likely that we didn't have a collapse to schwa at this point. So, St. Gall shows a rearrangement then of the vowel system not present elsewhere. We may have some hints in Milan. I think that we see some of it, but it's not systematic like this. It is consistent with what we see on the way to going to Middle Irish, where all final vowels become schwa, but it's not as advanced. And so I think a chronological change here seems the most likely explanation. It could be register, but it's clearly not the full collapse that McCone was suggesting. Yeah, the significant, well, this hasn't been seen before, that this was actually a regular change. And I think this is the best indication we have of how the collapse must have started. Well done. I think that you could think that it worked differently in different places and times, but this is the one example we have where we know, at least for the scribe of Milan, St. Gall, this is how the vowel collapse began. So, I think that's for sort of final vowels more generally, but what about O to A, which is what I started with? This appears to be somewhat different because it didn't generally collapse with A in the I stem singular and dual. Well, it's incipient, but it's most advanced in Milan, only in the U stems, and less so in St. Gall. So this would suggest it can't be truly a diachronic change. There's something else going on there. But I will now put in a caveat for the St. Gall data. Because of the sound change I just suggested, where O and A became E, that obliterated a number of data points. So I removed them. I removed from consideration originally all of the I and U stem dative singulars from St. Gall that ended in E, because I thought, oh, they're just wrong. They're showing something else, though. They're showing a subsequent change. So it could be, and I have that the St. Gall data, once I put those 13 data points back in, that's about 10% of the total. I don't know what it will show us. Because you could say, well, how can it show us anything? Because it has a different ending. It doesn't fit into this neat dichotomy. But I think using Bayesian statistics, I can suggest that basically it run a whole bunch of simulations. What if the distribution was this, or this, or this? And see what the most likely distribution is. So that's work for the future. I have to sort of redo some of what I showed you at first. I realize that may feel like a bait and switch, but it was a bait and switch to myself as well, because I thought I was done with that statistics, and I'm not. Okay, so to return to sort of the beginning, where I mentioned Humanities, I cited him for 2 ways forward when dealing with Old Irish language variation and change. He said one of those ways is by locating contemporary texts in space and time. So this is David Stifter's diagnostic project, and this, I think, has chances to reveal dialect variation. I don't know if it will, but I think a very close and careful examination of the immense amount of Middle Irish material gives us chances there. Or you could do what I did, which was very close examination of the linguistic structures, in this case, the phonology, and their orthography and the glosses. Now, what this will reveal is also sort of up in the air. It depends on the facts on the ground. In this case, in a sense, I got lucky. I found a sound change. I mentioned this to my wife one morning over breakfast. I said, I think I discovered something. And she thought I meant that she had like crumbs on her chin or something. I'm like, no. Yeah, but anyway. So what I find is obviously, you may or may not get lucky, but I think that this sort of examination has a chance to show us something. I think probably not dialect variation, but it will certainly show us variation in scribal orthographic practices. I've already seen that in Würzburg. I haven't talked about that here, but with the data I have collected on final vowels, you see very strongly the different scribal practices in writing the vowels. But I think that diachronic variation is very likely to pop up here. Now, something I didn't talk about is the sort of idea, what type of change is it? Is this a marked change that speakers will notice? Because these are the sorts of things that might have social significance. You could imagine the change of O to A could have social significance, but you could imagine that the collapse of O and A to E after palatalized consonants was somehow subconscious, and it wouldn't then have social significance. I don't know. But I think that here, there's plenty more to be had here. It takes a lot of data collection, but I'm optimistic that there's more variation to be found. And I hope to here have given you a small sort of sense of what's possible. I cited some people, and now I'd like to say thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you for being so gentle with us in Old Irish things. Thank you for a wonderfully clear presentation of some quite difficult, well, nothing in Old Irish is anything other than difficult, I think. Now, as is customary at the O'Donnell lecture, we won't open the floor to discussion and questions, but rather we retire now to a reception, which I'm not entirely sure where it is. So if you could bear with me while I locate it. But you're welcome to ask any questions and discuss the talk with the speaker.
And I will add, I'm really happy to talk about this because I think there's a lot more to do, and I'm happy to hear ideas or criticisms. And you can also say nice things. That's okay.
So thank you again. Thank you once again, Aaron.
It might be downstairs.
Sean is just coming, so Sean is going to tell us. Did you see it?
No, but usually when they do things in here, so if there's someone downstairs,
It is through. It just come out this way, and it's straight ahead of you in the next room.
I mean, because it's,
the hill. Master. Is it one year master? And then the next one. I have a similar during Irish.
Are you planning to?
Morphology. I think the difficulty there is this.
I don't work on
Almost everyone's going to show vowels and final vowels.
I mean, it depends on
There's so much. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I know David Stifter's got views on
Yes. Yeah.
Sorry, I meant Nara.
Yes.
what?
And there. That's all another possibility.
I am.
I think Milan again.
I don't have the data sort of in the back of my head. But
Anyway, I don't want to hold you up from your
They run it every 3 years.
so, yeah, thank you.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Around 6 years ago.
Well, I could keep writing my stuff. I can't get them.
Until 19.
Most likely. So, yeah, to work on Saints' lives.
That's gonna be so much fun.
No,
For at least 2 years. What's the research masters that can convert to a PhD diploma after a year and a half. So if I can't get one, we come back, basically.
Sorry? When?
I haven't heard it back officially yet.
Well, I had a little chat with him after.
They're all like,
Set him straight on a couple of things.
but I don't think I need to. Like, I know I'm in.
Just asked him if he'd looked at, was planning to look at morphology and lexical things.
My next word.
I think they're much more reliable than so-called phonology. I mean, you're in das and you're on das. You can't argue with that. And as he said, it's not phonology. And also some forms of definite article and stuff vary in peculiar ways.
Too many reform.
Hello.
How are you?
I don't know. I'm waiting for a reply to my email, I suppose.
Which email?
The one I sent.
Which one? The one where you
The one
can't
you
make it
didn't-
to coffee.
The one you didn't reply to.
Oh, I was so heartbroken that you couldn't
But
possibly.
I said I was available today, you see.
Well, my mum's in town.
Oh, hi.
Mum is after
Right.
Very well done.
Nice to meet
Did
you.
you enjoy the lecture?
I did actually.
Very good.
She's talked about some of the stuff so much so that I'm some familiarity and I was like interested in it. So this
Not
Yes, Carol.
is single lines.
Good.
I
Where's the place?
studied in
Actually, I was really pleased.
I was
graduate
done.
faculty of English.
It was a rare event
Yeah,
actually,
graduate.
talking about a real
I
subject, having
usually
something to say on it, which doesn't happen often enough.
I mean, I think the finding that the St. Gall clearly demonstrated it.
The underground.
It's diachronic in the face later.
Yeah.
It's all,
Size,
then again,
I
it
mean,
might not be.
the lectures.
Perhaps no.
Yeah, I kind of refuse to believe that there's no dialects whatsoever in Irish. It just seems.
I go everywhere.
Yeah, also, maybe the text I thought came from Bangor, which is,
Department of
I mean, I think it was a written standard. but
Yeah.
There was
Because I like
variation, which is very hard.
Yes,
to
yes.
grasp.
And that's in the other building.
Variation.
Oh, it's
Still
in here.
here.
Yeah, no, it used to be.
Yeah,
Because I used to go there too for some of the things on hermeneutics,
yeah,
philosophy of language.
yeah. Yeah, that's it.
Hello.
Okay.
Hello. Good to see you. If you don't go